Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? I can talk louder. Believe me, I can talk a lot louder. Welcome. This is a great turnout. You guys, those in the front row got to turn around and take a look. There's a lot of faces out there. And in this post-COVID world, that's an amazing thing, right? I mean, 2.5 years. I'll also confess that I was doing a lot of my one-day trainings on grease interceptors, and then COVID hit. So yesterday was my first one, and I think very close to 2 years. And I felt every minute of that. It's exhausting. So if you're speaking here today, it's okay. We haven't done this in a while, most of us, in-person stuff. I'm used to sitting now, right, and Zooming with somebody, so I don't get tired when I sit and Zoom. So if I get a little tired, just bear with me. And sleeping on strange beds, I'll whine about that, okay? I need a comfy bed, and these beds are hard. I was up all night. All right, so did you guys know that fog is a part of pretreatment? Yeah, right? And so Spencer said, hey, Ken, if you're going to come in and do your one-day class, then we want you to do a presentation to us too. I said, okay, I'll do that. How about this one? Is there fog in food waste? How many of you have heard me talk about this or seen anything on this before? A couple of you? Okay, most not, so that's good. The rest of you who have, too bad on you. All right, is there fog in food waste? This came up for me as a question because I was on the 2015 code committee for the International Plumbing Code. And I believe Wyoming, Colorado, this area is on the International Plumbing Code predominantly. And I was sitting on the committee that listens to all of the code changes and then makes a recommendation to the main body as to whether to approve those code changes, whether to amend those code changes, or whether to reject them. One of the code changes came up was that they wanted to change the, Spencer, if I go over like 2 minutes, is that all right? He left the room. That's way too much trust. So a code change came up that said we're going to take what the existing code said, which is if you put a food waste disposer in, raise your hand if you do not know what a food waste disposer is. All right, we're all tracking together then. If you put one of those in a commercial kitchen, we all have one in our homes, at least predominantly, except yours broke. I know, you told us yesterday. A knife, I think he said. Anyway, so if you put a commercial one in, the question is, the proposal was, forgive me, the proposal was if we don't want to put food waste disposal units and route them directly to sanitary. That's the policy as it was in the 2015. If you put in a food waste disposal unit, you have to also put in a solids interceptor between it and the sanitary system, or it and the grease interceptor, excuse me. So the code change was, let's take that out and let's say that food waste disposers must be routed directly to sanitary. So I'm on the dais, that's the elevated portion where all the people who have the say-so, so to speak, the voting members of the committee sit up there and listen to the testimony and then make their recommendations. So I'm sitting there and I'm listening to, so why should we not have a food waste disposer go through a solids interceptor before a grease interceptor? All of the testimony came from contractors predominantly, except for the code change proposer who worked for a manufacturer of commercial food waste disposers. So I listening to his testimony, the testimony basically was this. Putting a solids interceptor after a food waste disposal unit creates a burden on the facility to have to empty that solids disposer or that solids interceptor all the time. And that might discourage them from properly maintaining it, and therefore it's just going to be a hindrance when the better policy would be to just route that food waste disposer directly to sanitary. Then we have the testimony about how cathartic the food waste is that comes out of a food waste disposer. It's this, if you've seen the videos from some manufacturers, they use a glass pipe or a see-through pipe, and they run basically what looks like vegetables through their food waste disposer with some water, and it flows down in this beautiful slurry that looks like a diced up salad coming down this pipe, and that this is what's going to go into the collection system, and there's nothing wrong with that because the bacteria love that stuff. So it's really actually very healthy for the system to do that. And so I'm just the idiot up there that's saying, I live in this world called fats, oils, and grease, where we're trying to mitigate that discharge. So I'm wondering, hey, I have a question. Is there any fats, oils, and grease in there? Well, that's sort of a pushback. No, there can't be. In fact, the testimony was, a study came out of New York that said that there's less fats, oils, and grease in the discharge in a food waste disposal unit than there is in human feces. I'm sorry, it's early to use that word. So I decided to go ahead and investigate a little bit deeper. What is this study he's referring to? And does it really say what he says? Because Lord knows, nobody who represents a manufacturer may have a bias. It's possible. I'm not saying he did. It's possible he could be biased one direction. All right, so let me just walk you through some of the problems that we have that leading up to this question. Then I want to answer this question. Is there fog in food waste, and should we be concerned about it? We begin with the Uniform Plumbing Code and the International Plumbing Code because most of you still rely on the plumbing codes to direct your pretreatment program. Shame on you. It's not that there are terrible people here. These are great people, wonderful people. They help make sure we have safe, healthy, wonderful plumbing systems. But what do you think they know about pretreatment? I'll give you a hint. Nothing. They know nothing about pretreatment. And they don't need to. So they don't care what leaves the building. Okay, so in terms of you turn on a faucet, they don't really care what goes down the drain in that sense. It's like your problem. In the 1950s, they actually had policing powers. Here's an example, how things changed. In the 1940s and 50s, the plumbing inspector actually had police powers, which meant that he could go out and inspect your project, sign off on it, and when it came to grease interceptors, as an example, he could then come back later, and if you weren't maintaining it, he could actually write a ticket, and you could actually go to jail if you didn't properly maintain your interceptor. And then that ended at about 1954. And since then, the codes have said, whatever leaves the building is not our problem. It's your problem. So we have to deal with that. Here's what the Uniform Plumbing Code says. Food waste disposers and dishwashers. No food waste disposer or dishwasher shall be connected to or discharge into a grease interceptor. Commercial food waste disposers shall be permitted to discharge directly into the building's drainage system. Here's an exception to that. Food waste disposers shall be permitted to discharge into grease interceptors that are designed to receive the discharge of food waste. Most of you weren't at my class yesterday, so you wouldn't know the answer to this, but I'll just tell you. What is the interceptor that's designed to receive food waste? The answer is a residential septic tank that's being used as a commercial grease interceptor that you might know as a gravity grease interceptor. They're very good at solids. That's what they do. This just acknowledges that. So it's in the code that you can do that. But for every other type of interceptor, you have to route them directly to the building's drainage system. Okay? The International Plumbing Code says a food waste disposer shall not discharge to a grease interceptor. If we rely on the code, this is what it says. Now, the Uniform Plumbing Code has had this position for a long time. This position was adopted in the 2018. I'm the only person up there that would raise his hand to say, I think there's a lot of fog in that food waste. I don't think this is a good idea. And you know who wasn't there to help? Any of you. The pretreatment community doesn't largely know that they can participate in the plumbing code process. And if you are going to rely on that code as a part of your pretreatment program, may I suggest that you could get involved to see what that code says, because that's what you're going to have to live with. And I could have used some help here. Instead of a line of 30 contractors who all in their own best interest say, you know what, I'll probably lose a job if I have to try to convince that owner to put a solids interceptor in. So is his motivation cleaning up that wastewater discharge? No, it's getting the sale. And if that guy says you don't need one of those, and I say you do, then he's getting the job and I'm not. So what's the motivation? For me, not sell you on something that you don't need, that I don't have to put in. And if I don't have to put it in, I'm not going to put it in. So does this become a minimum or a maximum? If you're relying on the code, this is the maximum. We are not going to put solids interceptors in. We're going to route every food waste disposer directly to sanitary. The question is, that went fast. The question is there fog in food waste? Okay, so this was the study that was referred to. Kind of hard to see, isn't it? Commercial Food Waste Disposal Study, New York City, Department of Environmental Protection. This was published in 2008. Imagine if you're in New York. These people don't like to be told what to do. And they don't like to be told that what they're already doing doesn't work. So you're a manufacturer of food waste disposal units, commercial food waste disposal units, and in New York, you're not allowed to sell a device. They cannot install one throughout the 5 boroughs. Instead, they require composting. So that's a composting treatment plant up at the top. We have a commercial food waste grinder here to the left, which shows the competition, because this is how we collect the compost. So what New York simply said was, all right, these guys here are saying that the slurry, the stuff that comes out of a food waste grinder, is this wonderful, pristine vegetable that has really nothing else, because in their world, what they want us to believe is that we have a prep sink, and when we're chopping and dicing up fruits and vegetables, that the only thing that goes in that prep sink is going to be the scraps. Nothing else. So if that's true, then we can show a picture for you to understand that this is all that's coming out of this thing. Is this wonderful, diced up salad. That's all that's going down that thing. Okay, is that true? So New York says they want to know the same thing. If that's true, then that means that the only thing that we're going to find in these bins that you're required to set aside all of your food waste, well, that should just be vegetable choppings then, right? If that's what they're saying is true. But let's find out. So then they decided, okay, let's go ahead and take samples then from colleges and universities, from medical facilities, retail food establishments, including supermarkets. Let's take samples from restaurants and hotels. Let's take samples from caterers and shelters and non-public schools, senior centers. A whole big bunch of different types of food service establishments. Let's take samples of all of that food waste that they are currently required to compost or set aside to be composted that gets picked up. So we have 15 samples from the first, 32, 29, 61, and 35. What did they do? So they take these samples, they take them over to a laboratory, they set up a commercial food waste disposer with a water supply, they start running these samples through this food grinder, and they start taking effluent concentration samples. Is there fog in this food waste? In the first case, the number is 14.83. Then it's 1.03. Then it's 6. Then it's 18. Then it's 18.21. Who here is familiar with what our normal numbers are for effluent concentrations? What is it?
For our wastewater plant, it's always less than like 0.5, less than 1.
Less than 1.
Yeah.
How do you measure that?
EPA 1664.
Okay, so what's being reported here? Did you guys all hear that? So what's being reported right here? What do you see here? Grams per kilogram. What is that measurement for? That's weight. That's a solid, right? So we measure solids that way. EPA 1664 does not report in grams per kilogram. How is it reported? Milligrams per liter. If I'm looking at numbers, and if you're talking to a group of people who really don't know, like off the top of their head, like let's say 14 guys sitting up here that really know plumbing systems but maybe don't know anything about pretreatment, and you say, look, pretreatment programs are used in numbers like 100 or 200 or 300, but maybe you don't actually say that's milligrams per liter. And maybe you do, but nobody really realizes that this is grams per kilogram, not milligrams per liter, and that there's a difference between those two things. This seems pretty low if I'm comparing it to 100, right? But if I'm comparing that in milligrams per liter, we need to convert that, right? So if I convert that to milligrams per liter, really what we're talking about is 14,000 here, 1,000, 6,000, 18,000, 18,000. Now compare that, for those of you that have an effluent concentration maximum, does that strike you as being somewhat elevated? I mean, at the end of the day, is there fog in food waste? This is a pretty simple answer. Does New York today, based on this study, allow commercial food waste grinders? No, they don't. Now, do you suppose that's because they drew a conclusion from this that maybe was different than the conclusion they were told they were supposed to draw? That that's not just a salad of food scraps made during the preparation of fruits and vegetables, that maybe there's more to it than that. This says there's a lot more to it than that. When you really look at what's inside all of the food waste that people are doing, everything that goes down there. Now, how are normally these things set up in a kitchen? For those of you who don't know, how many actually have been in or worked in a commercial kitchen or do inspections of that? Raise your hand. How many not? Come on, put your hands up so I can see. Okay, it's like a third of the room hasn't. Okay. Most of the time, the food waste grinder that's approved for a commercial installation is put on a pre-rinse sink. And where does the pre-rinse sink sit? It sits in front of a dishwasher. So we don't have the idea that there's a dedicated food scrap or prep sink with a food waste grinder on it, and that's the only place that anybody would ever dare put a food scrap, is not what reality is. Reality is we normally put those on a pre-rinse sink, and we put everything in that food waste grinder. If it's a scrap in the kitchen and it's food-based, if it's on a plate, pot, or pan, it's going in there. That's how they're normally used today. That's what puts the deception behind the testimony. Okay.
Hey, Cal.
Yes?
And the person that washes the dishes is the lowest paid person in the building.
That could be. That could be. He's saying that maybe we're not paying the CEO to do that. All right. So we have a high concentration of fog. You know what? To give you a mental comparison, hydromechanical grease interceptors are tested for performance. Do you know if we were to take the volume of grease and convert that into milligrams per liter per test cycle, do you know what the number is? And we call this a stress test. It's designed to stress a grease interceptor to validate that it works. It's 12,000 milligrams per liter. Okay, so that gives you a sense of how much grease we're talking about. We call that a stress test, and what we're seeing here in concentrations of food waste is even higher than that, coming out of one fixture. Okay, so I knew this was Bismarck, because I remember you and I did this a couple of years ago. Didn't I do that demonstration for the R8PA? I think I did. For those of you that were there 2.5 years ago, I believe I was here, and I think I did a demonstration of emulsion. Because at the end of that, I'm left with this jar, which might still be sitting over there in the Teton room. Wyoming, I told you yesterday, that's the property of Cheyenne. I left it. I'm being honest about that. I walked out, I didn't even look back. It's there on the table. I think she said you guys are going to be responsible for that.
All is expensive.
So, anyway, I did this demo, and I show what emulsions look like and how they work. And at the end of that, I remember you taking me back to the kitchen at the hotel we were at, right? Because weren't we in Bismarck? I'm sure this was you and I that did this.
Dean did that.
Did it? Was it Dean?
Yeah.
Oh, Dean, you did that? Okay. I knew it was one of you guys. So I was at the end of that. He takes me back and he shows me, he says, let's dispose of it. Because I said, look, this is a jar. It has oil and water and soap in it. Dean, do you want to just dump this down the sink? Obviously not. So he says, let's go back in here to this kitchen and let's take a look. And so what do we find? Well, we find this grease interceptor sitting right here. And this is their what? Yeah, that's their 3-comp sink. And this was a bunch of plates already stacked up and washed and clean and beautiful looking. And we open this up. Dean, you got to help me out here. I don't remember there being a lot of grease in there. Exactly. There was hardly any grease in that thing at all. So I'm like, how do you think they operate this kitchen? He says, turn around. So we turned around. And literally on the other side of the kitchen is this tray here, and all these pots and pans and stacked up trays here, and I don't know what's in some sauce sitting in this side of a thing. And that somebody didn't eat their breakfast, I guess. Look, if you're going to take that much food and not eat it, anyway, I'm joking around. So obviously this is where all the dirty pots, pans, plates, trays, all that's being done. What is this? Can you see it? I know, I'm doing it only on that screen. Can you see what's in this over here? That's a sink. Normally, previously, it had a commercial food waste grinder underneath it. Does that surprise you? That all of these dishes are going to be washed, rinsed, and scrubbed down and prepped for going through what? The dishwasher. So they're prepping the dishwasher. Now here's what the code says. A dishwasher connected to a pre-rinse sink. This is a pre-rinse sink, right? Pre-rinse sink. So this dishwasher is connected to a pre-rinse sink. shall not discharge to a grease interceptor. All right? So where is this dishwasher discharging to? Directly to sanitary. Now the code says a pre-rinse sink with a food waste disposal unit connected to it shall not discharge to a grease interceptor. So where is this being routed to? Directly to sanitary. Where's all the grease load in this kitchen going? It's not going in the 3-comp sink. We looked. It's going right there. That's why you see tomatoes. It looks like tomatoes to me. I think I remember them being tomatoes, diced up tomatoes. That's why you see food in there. Now, the challenge for these people is there's no longer a food waste grinder on that. So now they're just clogging up their pipes when they do food into there. But you know for a fact they're still doing it. And so all of the grease load from this kitchen is going directly to sanitary. Here's a different example. Private secondary education facility in Andover, Massachusetts. So I was hired here years ago to go and see these folks because they got a bill from the city for about, it was like $15,000. And it was because, quote, you are discharging fog to the collection system and we've got nothing but problems downstream of you. So for about 3 miles, we're sending you the bill for all the cleanup of all the fog that's in that piping. It's coming from you. We can see that it's coming from you, so you're responsible for it. Of course, this is private education, which means money, right? Everybody looks at them and says, you guys have money coming out your ears, so you can afford to pay for it, so that's what you're going to do. Now, we all know that administrators would rather pay themselves than pay the city for a cleaning bill. That's just, everybody would know that. That's not rocket science. So they hired me to say, come here and help us fix this because we don't want to pay this anymore. Okay, so let's take a look at the kitchen. This is what they said the problem was. From here, here's where the facility is located. All of this piping, all the way down. Here's a tip, by the way. If you're going to send somebody a bill, don't let them hire a consultant to come in and challenge what you're doing. What is 3 and 2 doing on this list? Because this pipe flows all the way down to here, yet they billed them for 2 and 3. I don't remember grease in a wasteline system traveling uphill. So I don't know how they got grease from Andover, from this facility into 2 and 3, which would have been flowing this way. I'm just putting that out there because that's one of the challenges that I said they shouldn't have to pay for these 2. That means, by the way, that other facilities were contributing fog to 2 and 3. So we should be looking at where that fog's coming from, and that could be high-density housing. Would that make sense if we're next to a school, a private school that kids go to and there are dorms? Yeah, there could be private housing, multifamily housing up here someplace that's contributing to that, something to look at. So anyway, they ended up having to pay for all of this. So I go into this facility. This is the Peresky Commons is their food facility. And we start taking a look. We go into the facility and we go into the basement, start in the basement, and this is their grease interceptor. It's a Big Dipper 750, so it's a 75 gallons per minute automatic grease removal device. It's working perfectly fine, except what I noticed was there's a lot of gray water in here, and I didn't see any fog in that. So my first question is, those of you who don't know anything about automatic grease removal devices is, this tank has to fill up first because these skim grease off the top. If you don't let it fill up with grease, there's no grease to skim off the top. If you let it run when there's no grease, you fill up the container with wastewater. So I'm asking you, how often are you running this thing? The guy said, I don't know, like 20 hours a day. It's never getting any grease in it. And so you get a little bit of grease in this container here, and the rest of it's going over to the, and the rest is just wastewater. Anyway, so this is working just fine, but this is in the basement, and you've got 2 stories, and now, but it has a basement kitchen, a first floor, a primary floor kitchen, and a second floor kitchen. And they have huge facilities there, 2 giant buffets. The main floor kitchen is a buffet out front, and the second floor is a huge buffet, and they have all kinds of menus, so the kids have about 35 different restaurant-type choices of food to have there, so it's pretty big. The downstairs, or the basement area, is fed by these tanks here. In other words, these tanks are the gravity tanks that feed that interceptor. These tanks are elevated, and they receive their grease from buried tanks that receive all the wastewater from the rest of the facility. So my job was, Ken, tell us where's the grease coming from? All of the fixtures in the building are connected to that interceptor. So I'm like, okay, well, let's just validate that. Are they all connected to this interceptor? So that's what I'm saying. That interceptor is fed by these tanks. Those tanks are fed by 2 buried tanks right here. Those tanks receive all of the greasy waste from all the fixtures that are in the basement. These are all the basement fixtures. I don't know if they're all the basement fixtures, but there are a lot of the basement fixtures. I only found throughout all the research, I only found that the floor drains, predominantly the floor drains were the only things that were not connected to that device. Only the floor drains. Okay? So everything else was going there. So I'm thinking, that's interesting. Like 100% of your fixtures are going to that? Well, it's not quite 100%, but there's a lot here. You can see all the different types of fixtures. This is all in the basement. Here's your 3-comp sink. A little clue, though, I started to notice this guy down in here. What is all of this? Let me see if I've got a picture of this here. Yeah, so here's our 3-comp sink operation, and this gentleman's working it here. And I don't know what this thing is. I've never seen one of these things before. And this word here is SOMAT. Can you see that? I know I'm like totally focused on this side of the room. Sorry about you guys on this side. This word over here is SOMAT. So that's like a system then. I'd never heard of a SOMAT system before, so I had to look it up. What is this SOMAT system and what does it do? And what is this? Well, this happens to be a giant grinder, as you can see by its size, pretty big grinder, and that it feeds somehow to this SOMAT system. That's interesting. And then there's a drain pipe here that connects to a floor drain indirectly. Okay, that's interesting. And that's what I'm trying to show you here. Here's the indirect connection that comes out of both the sink, indirect connection here out of the sink, and the SOMAT system. Okay. Now we go upstairs, and I start looking around at the fixtures upstairs. Where's all the grease coming from? Most of the operations upstairs, the 2 big kitchens have these giant conveyor belt type dishwashers. Sorry, my brain may cramp a couple of times. Feel free to yell out a word to help. I get to make all the early mistakes since I'm the first presenter, and I'm happy to just do that. I'll make them all the rest of you presenters have it easy after me. So I'm looking at this operation, and now on this side we see people putting dishes, right? They're putting it on this, whatever this thing is, and this is a conveyor belt too, and it's moving dishes across. So this nice lady, she picks up the dish off here, and she scrapes it into this trough-looking thing, right? You can see that trough. And it's got what in it? Food, lots of food. Looks like taco meat and broccoli. That's what that looks like right there. Okay, so my first question is, I see all this food here. How do you get rid of it? And she says, well, we turn on the river. Okay, that's a fun term. Let's see what that does. She says, so she did. She walked over, she hit a switch, and this thing starts flowing like a river. And it's got a pretty good pace to it, too, a scouring pace. So all that food that was there just gets this river just kind of washes it away. So, my question's going to be, that's great. That's neat. Now, where does that go? She says, well, that goes into this thing. Well, what is that thing? Well, that's a pulper. What's a pulper do? She says, well, that grinds up all of the food waste that comes out of the river. All right, so let me make sure I follow this here. You guys scrape all the food from all the dishes, pots, and pans and stuff that you're going to run through that dishwasher behind you, right? She says, yes. And it all goes in this trough, yes. And then you turn a lever and a river flows in this trough, yes. And that river goes to that. And she said, yes. And then that thing grinds it up. And she says, yes. Sounds like we're on the same page so far. Where does that go? She says, well, that goes downstairs. To what? This. Well, what is this? I love manufacturers that have great names. This is a hydra extractor. What does a hydra extractor do? Well, it takes that pulped water and food, and it takes all the water out of it, and it shoots that food down that chute. I used chute twice in a row. I'm sorry about that, Adam. It takes the food that's dewatered now, and it runs it down this chute into this bin, and then some local pig farmers come and pick that food waste up. Okay, this is making sense. So where does the wastewater from this thing go? And she goes, well, it goes back into the system. So that's like a closed loop system? Yep, that's what that is. Okay. So I go upstairs to the second floor, and there happens to be another one. And they're doing exactly the same thing. So now I got 3 of these operations, all connecting somehow to this SOMAT system. One, the basement one's got that food waste grinder on it that we saw that was very open and very obvious. These others had pulpers, which you can't see what's going on in there, right? So now you know what's going on in there. It's chopping up food. So that's 3 locations all with that. So I called up SOMAT and I said, I'm really confused here. Can you help me understand how your system works? And they said, sure. So here's a schematic of it, and I won't bore you to tears with trying to walk through all the details of this schematic, but just suffice it to say that the schematic is going to show 3 floors and a closed loop with pumps. So the pumps are going to keep that system going. The pumps keep the wastewater moving through the system. And that always is going to be recycling. But what you will notice here is right here at the bottom. What does this say? What's that say at the very bottom? You probably can't see it at the back. Floor sink with 3-inch takeaway. So the systems have a discharge point at the first floor, the second, or the top floor, main floor, and basement all have a discharge point. And that discharge point says floor sink with 3-inch takeaway. How do we connect to a floor sink? Directly or indirectly? So that indirect connection that I saw in the basement was a bit of a clue, wasn't it? So this is the second floor, and then this is the basement. And all of that is a closed loop system. So here's a great question. This is the final piece. This is the Hydra extractor. When it finally gets to that, so the question then is, what happens at the end of shift when you're done running the river and cleaning the pots and the pans and the plates and the silverware and all that stuff? What happens? What do? We turn the system off. Okay, that makes sense. Then what? Well, we have to drain it. Well, how do you do that? Well, we pull this plug. Well, where does that go? Just confirming what the schematic says, it goes to the floor drains, those floor sinks that are indirectly connected. You know what the code said? This is a Uniform Plumbing Code state, and the Uniform Plumbing Code says, thou shalt not discharge a food waste grinder through a grease interceptor. So where's all that greasy waste going? It's going directly to sanitary. So when the facility said, I have all my fixtures connected to an interceptor, do they? No, they don't. All those fixtures, we might look at all those fixtures and say, wow, yeah, if all of those fixtures are connected to a grease interceptor, they're getting all their grease waste. Except, where's really all their grease waste going? It's going here. And where's all of this grease waste going? It's going directly to sanitary, which is going to the collection system, which means how much are we capturing and how much are we not? So I did some numbers to try to find out how much grease are we producing here. Well, they're a cafeteria, basically a cafeteria, and with fryer, with flatware, I just ran this math. So that's a 0.0455 multiplier for that general basic overview menu. That's like the big catch-all that I would use for grease production. And I ran the numbers. How much grease are we using? Well, we use 0.455. How many customers or meals per day? That's not too tough. 1,100 students plus faculty and staff. So that's around 3,571 meals per day. Well, that means it's 162 pounds of grease per day being produced. The vast majority, the overwhelming majority of that going through the SOMAT system. In 30 days, that's 4,860 pounds. In 90 days, 14,580 pounds. In 1 year, 58,800 pounds of grease. How much? Come on. At some point, that's just a really big number, but how much? What does that even mean? Is it meaningful? I have to look at that. All right, that's a 55-gallon drum. Can you at least picture what that size would be, roughly, right? About this big. Well, that's 3 of those per week with grease, dumping directly into the collection system. That's 12 per month, 48 per quarter, 144 of those a year. I did a secondary comparison using the math that came out of the New York study, 18,210 milligrams per liter for a non-public school, using 11,200 gallons of daily water. Estimated 10% was running through the SOMAT system because it's closed loop, not continuously refeeding it. That's 0.0151. If I multiply that out, 169 pounds a day, 5,000 per month, 15,000 per quarter, 60,000 per year. Pretty close between the two, wouldn't you say? That's two ways of looking at how much grease we're producing from this facility. Two very different ways of looking at it, and yet both of them corroborate each other very closely. Thermocoat, if we try to figure out what they're actually capturing, if we were being very generous here about how they're doing this, they've got this Thermocoat Big Dipper W750IS at 75 gallons a minute. They're filling up this drum, they say, every 2 weeks. 55-gallon drum emptied every 2 weeks. Let's assume that was full of grease. We know that's not true. But let's assume for their sake that it is. 55 gallons times 7.3 pounds per gallon is 400 pounds of grease in that drum. 26 every 2 weeks is 10,400 pounds captured. So I'm just going to try to say, being super generous here, they're probably capturing about 10,000 pounds. They're creating about 58 to 60,000 pounds. So what percentage is that that's going directly to sanitary? Capturing, with my generous math, 17%, we're discharging a whopping 82% of the grease load directly to sanitary. So that's why I asked the question, is there fog and food waste? Yeah, there's fog and food waste. And so the whole idea that we let the plumbing code decide for pretreatment whether or not we should have food waste grinders routed directly to sanitary is bad policy. It's very harmful for pretreatment. So I encourage you to do something about that, get involved in either helping us to change the code or fix your ordinance and supersede the code. Don't allow food waste grinders in your ordinance. All right? That's pretty much it.